Born in Wiltshire in 1147, William Marshal found himself as a young boy aged only 5 years of age a hostage to King Stephen. William's father, John Marshal, was an enemy of King Stephen, and Stephen could have potentially have had William hanged for his father's treachery. However, on seeing little William ask to play with a soldier's spear, the king was touched and instead chose to raise little William at his court. Learning his trade in Normandy as a potential knight, it wouldn't be long before William, with limited means, would begin to make a grand name for himself. His first particular notable act came in 1168 when he saved Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of Henry II, from an ambush. Although William was injured and taken prisoner, he had served his main purpose by ensuring that Queen Eleanor reached safety. What's more, William's bravery had done enough to take the Queen's eye, and over the coming decades, William Marshal would come to be indispensable for the English crown and the very embodiment of what it took to be a knight in the Middle Ages. The reign of Eleanor's husband, Henry II, would experience a good deal of turmoil from the mid 1170s onwards, caused in part by Eleanor herself. Henry's sons rose up in rebellion against their father, and although there were periods of calm, it proved to be hugely distressing for the king to have to wage war against his own sons. Towards the end of his reign, it would be Richard, now heir to the throne, who posed the biggest threat to Henry II. Richard had grown into a fine warrior, and he used those martial skills to destabilize his father's Angevin empire. There was one man, however, who could get the better of Richard, as prestigious as his martial skills were. That was William Marshal. With Richard very much having his father on the run in their war, he would, at Le Mans, find himself face to face with Marshal, who promptly unseated the unruly prince from his horse whilst Henry II retreated. It is a powerful scene to imagine Prince Richard, now known to history as the Lionheart, lying in the mud, staring up at the figure of William Marshal, possibly in fear for his life. In reality, Richard's life was in no real danger at that point. Marshal, a now fully mature knight in total control of his emotions, was certainly not going to slay Richard, heir to the English crown, but he was going to teach the prince a harsh lesson he would remember, killing Richard's unfortunate horse in front of the prince's eyes. This told Richard in no uncertain terms what Marshal thought of his disloyalty. It was a lesson that Richard would take on board. After becoming king, Richard would go on to forge a legendary name for himself on crusade. William Marshal would certainly have made an equally great reputation had he chosen the life of a crusader, something that was certainly on his mind, but instead Marshal chose a life that was altogether more admirable, ensuring peace and stability in England. During the turbulent days of Richard's absence, particularly whilst he was hostage in Germany, and during the even more turbulent days of King John and the early days of the reign of Henry III, it would be Marshal who held things together in England. In the summer of 1215, at Runnymede, King John and his nobles found themselves eyeing each other with a great deal of mistrust and dislike. The king found himself with very few notable supporters, whilst the barons remained disgusted with John's dreadful misrule, and now sought to keep him in check by forcing him to agree to Magna Carta. There was only one problem. How could two sides with such obvious differences possibly come to terms? What the situation needed was a respected middleman, someone who both sides could trust. Naturally, there was one man for this solemn duty, William Marshal. After hours of tense discussions, made possible by Marshal's calm and steadying demeanour, John eventually put his seal on the charter, although, John being John, this didn't stop him from doing his best to go back on his word later on. Nonetheless, Magna Carta, the one positive legacy of King John's reign, had come about because of William Marshal. Were it not for him and his intercessions, it's likely that that day at Runnymede would have ended with nothing accomplished. King John died in October 1216, leaving England in a terrible mess. He'd persuaded Pope Innocent III to declare Magna Carta null and void, and as a result, the English barons, fed up with John, asked Prince Louis of France to come and depose King John. John's successor was his 9-year-old son, Henry III, and it would be up to William Marshal to ensure the crown stayed with Henry in the face of Louis's unwelcome presence in England. Initially, William was reluctant to act as guardian for Henry, which he made clear following Henry's first hasty coronation at Gloucester. Marshal, approaching 70 years of age, was too old for the task, he claimed, and there were other respected men who could perform the duty with equal distinction. But, such was Marshal's standing, he was urged to accept the role of the king's protector, and eventually William agreed. And William soon proved that age was no barrier for him, at least not at this stage. In 1217, he marched on Lincoln, coming to the aid of Nicola de la Haye, the remarkably courageous female sheriff who was holding out staunchly against a portion of Louis's French army. Having dealt with the siege, William had ensured that any momentum in Louis's campaign gradually began to fall away. An agreement was reached that saw Louis leave England for good. The Battle of Lincoln was William Marshal's last great act in decades of service to the English crown. He died aged 72 in 1219, a diplomat, a national hero, and a warrior to the very last.